Hello and welcome to my Yu-Gi-Oh channel. In today's video we'll be looking at how will the new field be adapted for Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links to change for the pendulums. This is going to be theory 1 of 3 that I'm creating, and I have given it quite a lot of thought about how they're going to newly design these. Okay, so I know this has been the major question for a lot of people when they've been looking forward to what it comes to exactly how the field is going to be adapted to account for the new pendulum monsters. Theory 1 for me is the field will stay the same. The idea would be the same as what they had when Pendulum Monsters had their first release. For anyone who doesn't know, Pendulum Monsters could be summoned at any point from either the hand and or the extra deck when they have either been destroyed or sent there by other effects. By this angle, there would not be an extra monster zone. Instead, you would keep the main monster zones and therefore be able to special summon up to 3 monsters, assuming you have no monsters already clogging up your field, and you could pendulum summon as many times as you want in terms of monsters, once per turn, provided you have the relevant pendulum scales. So what would actually need to change? You would need the addition of software to recognize pendulum monsters, alongside understanding differences between their pendulum and their monster effects. Scales will need to be highlighted so both players are aware of the scales players can special summon with. Unique pendulum animation could also be introduced to help get players excited for the new summoning. You need the ability to have pendulum monsters face up in the extra deck when they're destroyed or sent there by other effects. So what are the benefits of using this original strategy? The idea would be it would be a 3 zones versus the 5 zones of traditional Yu-Gi-Oh! This would be less spammy, as you would have less access to zones to overwhelm your opponent, and they can counter this strategy effectively without becoming overwhelmed. This is the original way that pendulums were intended, and if you are playing pendulums as well, then there should really be no complaints and no difference. You are doing exactly the same as what your opponent is. There is the potential to only enable pendulums to work within that dual world, letting players also choose whether they want to start playing pendulum monsters or not. So you can actually limit this potentially to the world itself. I know they have certain characters that won't spring up within all the other dimensions, just because, you know, the story characters from the original series of Yu-Gi-Oh! So Yami Yugi, Joey Wheeler, Tristan Taylor, people like that, Seto Kaiba, you will never see within Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, you'll never see in 5Ds or vice versa, because they just weren't relevant for that time. I think they could do something like that. At least that way it would stop players from randomly spamming these pendulum decks for those who just don't like the mechanic. And you'll have people on either side of the fence, some who love the mechanic and how broken it might become, and then you'll have those who just don't like the idea of it in general. And I would also say the final benefit would be pendulums have restrictions on themselves. For example, some can only work for certain types of cards, or be able to alter their scales if the monsters being pendulum summoned are different to what the declared type is intending to be played with. So for example, with Despots, they can only summon through their pendulum scales any monster that is a Despot archetype. They cannot summon anything else. So if you're trying to splash multiple things, I would say, unless they're specifically needed, don't bother. Konami already knows the types of plans that you're trying to do. They've already made these contingencies in place, and don't assume they're not going to ban certain cards if they feel that, you know, you're abusing the system too heavily. Now, as for the problems with this theory, certain decks are known to be overpowered, such as Pepe, which is a combination of the Perform Pals and the Perform Ages. Once they were introduced together, Konami knew they had to be restricted. It needs to be constantly updated with a rolling ban list to avoid these becoming a mess and over-dominated within the official ranking system. You need to assume that everyone will be playing pendulums, and when this format came out of the original Yu-Gi-Oh!, most people absolutely hated it, as this enabled players to constantly resummon their monsters until the opponent had no resources to counter their pendulum monsters with. So for example, you do have the extra monster zone, which you've got in, you know, your extra deck. That means you can constantly recycle those monsters, and it just ends up being a point where you can no longer recover any of your good spell and trap cards. And it also says that there aren't any intended consequences for playing a ton of pendulum monsters. Overall, I think that Theory 1 looks at the original idea of pendulum monsters and considers this not to be advisable, as it can become dominant too quickly. If this was to be used, ban lists would need to be adopted every so often, to balance them. For my recommendation, it would basically be whenever new cards were released, whether that be from the new booster sets, the mini boxes, or even with some character side events. There would need to be a restriction on keeping the extra deck to a maximum of 7 cards to prevent archetypes from exploding. And lastly, they might need to restrict Pendulum monsters to their own competitive format outside of normal Duel Links to avoid discouraging new players. What do you guys think of these suggestions? Do you like Theory 1, and do you think this is actually the original way they're going to go about this? Or do you think this is a complete non-starter and actually they might be using just the brand new rules with the brand new restrictions? Whatever you think, put those in the comments down below, like the video if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe for more daily Yu-Gi-Oh content.